Before we get started, I want to let everybody know that next Sunday on the 24th, we're going to be having a baptism celebration. So this will be a combined event that we will have during normal church time. And during that time, there are 3 individuals in our church family who said that they wanted to get baptized. It runs the gambit from individuals who have never been baptized before to individuals who were baptized in the past, but especially after some of the lessons we've gone over, realized that maybe their baptism was done for other reasons that didn't really have the same meaning that we know is intended through baptism in the Bible. So with that being said, we're going to have this. It's going to be a fantastic time, but I also want to extend the invitation. If you are looking at yourself, and if you maybe in the past have said, you know, I don't know that maybe the baptism I had was done because my family did it, or done because my church told me I had to do it to become a member, but it didn't have that meaning, or maybe you've never been baptized before and you want to make that commitment. If you want to, please let me know over the course of the next week, because we'll have the opportunity. And as we kind of studied with Philip and the Ethiopian several weeks ago now, it's going to be one of those situations where we look and we say, there is water, why can I not be baptized? So with that being said, you want to be baptized, please let me know. It's going to be an awesome time, and I look forward to seeing all of you next Sunday. The book of Jeremiah is one of the coolest when it comes to the prophets. It's not necessarily cool because it has the most esoteric stuff in it, but it's cool because of what it represents. You know, something that's kind of interesting that you end up seeing in the New Testament is that individuals actually thought that maybe Jesus was Jeremiah because of some of the similarities between how Jeremiah was received and how Jesus was received. I mean, they had some very similar traits, you know. Jeremiah was an individual who definitely bucked against the traditional religious authorities. He was very much rejected by a lot of the world that was around him, and he talked an awful lot about the destruction of Jerusalem and eventually God's faithfulness to his covenant, which sounds an awful lot like what Jesus ended up doing on the cross. It really is interesting when you even look at his life, because he saw the full gambit of the experience of God's faithfulness to his will and to his covenant and the promises that he makes to us. You see, Jeremiah was initially sort of appointed or anointed as a prophet under a righteous king of Judah named Josiah. And then right after that, you had Josiah's son, who was Jehoiakim, that was an individual that deviated from what God wanted. And then shortly after that, you ended up having the Babylonians coming in and oppressing Judah, eventually subjugating it, installing a proxy king essentially, and then eventually the exile of the nation of Judah into Babylon. So when you look at that, you end up realizing that he saw the entire thing. I mean, he saw a nation that was following God kind of, you know, in prosperity. He saw, you know, the deceit, and saw individuals falling away from God. He saw God's judgment, and then he also was imbibed with this prophecy of God's faithfulness in the end. So he saw the entire arc of what we experience in our own lives. It really is something that, even though it's a prophet, and even though he was talking about things that were contemporaneous to a time period and a nation very different than us, it's something that we can relate to because it very much mimics our own lives, how we too experience some of these same moments where we oftentimes experience these kind of high points in our lives, especially when we first become a Christian, where we experience this euphoria of knowing Christ, and then we so often have these moments where we start kind of getting lax, we start kind of falling away, and you can start seeing maybe even an ounce of rebellion within us. And so often when that happens, God permits us to go through these trials and these periods where we're kind of undergoing this sense of discipline, but then there's God's grace and God's forgiveness on the tail end of it all. And so we live lives that mirror very much what Jeremiah was experiencing. And because of that, it's very interesting to go through a study of his own life. And so that's what we're going to be doing over the next few weeks, is digging into this. But we have to start out by looking at who Jeremiah is and why this is so important to our experience as Christians today. This first this week, we're just going to look at Jeremiah 1. We're going to keep it pretty simple, and you see the calling of Jeremiah. In here is something I think is very, very relatable, and that is the hesitation that Jeremiah has, and then God's response to that. Because you see Jeremiah initially being called by God and turning around and saying, I can't do it, I'm too young, I don't have the words. And when you see that, really that's just a proxy for fear. And I think a lot of us do that, right? If we think God is calling us to do something, we'll sit here and explain why, well, maybe I'm not the right person. Maybe I'm not the right person to go talk to somebody else, or I'm not the right person to serve in this way. I'm not the right person to lead. And we'll make up those excuses. But in reality, those are all just forms of fear. Because after all, if God is calling us to do something, doesn't that mean He's going to equip? And that's actually exactly what we see. We see God first sanctifying Jeremiah by saying, I choose you. The next thing that we see is God says, I will sustain you, through this phrase that, where He says, I will be with you. And we actually see this a few different places in the Bible that you guys can, if you want, when the title card pops up, go through. But then the other thing that we see is that God equips us, that He gives us either the sense of authority, He gives us the position, He gives us the words, the wisdom, the energy, the time, whatever it is that we need in order to do the thing that He has called us to do. What you can see in the calling of Jeremiah is this idea of answering a calling, but that answer coming in the form of surrender. And I think that's oftentimes what people forget about Christianity. In a world that wants to see so many pastors like celebrities, and they want to, kind of elevate these different offices in a church like deacon and elder and all that kind of stuff to being something that's, bigger than life, they forget the fact that serving is not about you standing up to a challenge of victory. It's about you surrendering to God's plan in your life, which may be very different than your plan in your life. Furthermore, it's surrendering to what God's will is and His standard of success is. Because so often what happens are individuals will have a calling, they think they see a calling, they get very passionate about it, but then they presume what they think success is at the end of that, not understanding that God may have a different plan. He may let us see pushing something over the goal line, or He may just want us to move the ball down the field a little bit. So as we sit here and we look at our own callings, I think we can relate to Jeremiah, because after all, we all have things that make us nervous when God asks us to do big jobs. As we continue on in Jeremiah 1, we see some interesting metaphors here. And this is something that in all the prophets, you're going to see a lot of metaphors, a lot of analogies, a lot of visions. And you see that right here. And God shows Jeremiah these two things. He shows them first a branch. It's an almond branch is the way most of your Bibles will translate it. And this is important because an almond branch is known for its almond flowers, and those flowers bloom very, very early, and so it's actually known as the watching tree or the watching flower. The reason why that's so significant is because God is communicating to Jeremiah, and you'll see this when you read it, that I will be with you, that I will watch you, that I will be there and accompany you as you do these things. What a comforting thought, because how many individuals maybe start out doing something that is good-natured or good intended, but then they suddenly start trying to do it on their own power. I can tell you right now, if I tried doing this whole bivocational pastor thing on my own power, I would burn out in a week max. So when we go out and we do these things that God is calling us to do, we have to ensure that we are doing it knowing that God is with us, relying on His strength and not on our own. The second thing that we see is something that actually kind of imbibes onto Jeremiah his sense of authority, that he sees this double-spouted bowl of boiling water, and what this is doing is it's symbolizing, it flat out says, the judgment that God is going to have against His people who've fallen away from Him. But here's what's super interesting about that. I want you to pay attention in this section to who it says is the instrument of God's judgment. And what you see is that God is using the pagans. Well, that's fascinating because he's punishing or permitting punishment to happen to His chosen people, but yet these pagans are the individuals that God is using for His works. And there's a fascinating parallel that you could draw in here to some of the things that we see Christ say, that we see in some of the epistles that Paul writes, that if we sit here and we think that our works alone are going to justify us, we're going to fail, because it's by grace alone that we're justified. And I point to this because you have to recognize that God even uses pagans, people who do not recognize his authority. And what that means is that the works themselves aren't what justify you, because these pagans were still pagans. It's that God used them. And so in reality, what we have to look at as Christians is we have to ask ourselves, are we trying to live our lives in such a way that we are just simply instruments of works, or do we have a heart that is actually pursuing God? Because after all, that is the place where the individuals in Jerusalem went wrong. They stopped pursuing God's heart, and because of that, God said, fine, if you don't want my heart, then I'll show you what life is like without me. I'll show you what life is like when you pursue other things, and we'll see how long you can last. And just as I said, if I tried doing my calling without God's strength, I wouldn't last a week. What we see is that Judah would not continue to survive until the end of Jeremiah's life. Now, I'll go ahead and tell you, when I first started this, I had this crazy thought initially, like, oh, maybe we can sit here and go through every single little bit of Jeremiah. But here's a fun piece of trivia. Jeremiah has more written words in it than any other book in the Bible. So needless to say, we're not going to go chapter by chapter through this book. It would quite literally take 52 weeks. So what we are going to do is we're going to take different blocks of it, and we're going to kind of walk through it, because I think you learn an awful lot about the nature of what Christ was doing. You start seeing that just as Christ looks at us in our sinful state and in our sense of rebellion and says, I still offer grace to you, I am still true to you, and I want to be a part of your life. You see the exact same thing even in the midst of God's judgment. You see God looking at his people and saying, I know you have rebelled. I know what your sin is. I know that you're pursuing things that are not me, but I am still, even in the midst of judgment, going to provide a path back to me, a path back to restoration. That is the exact same journey so many of us live in our own lives, where we look and we say that, we have pursued our own ends, we have continued to rebel, we've pursued things that are not honoring to God. And it's a blessed thing and a humbling thing to understand that even though some of those choices may lead to humbling and may lead to discipline, that Christ still desires our hearts, that God desires to have a relationship with you, and that is ultimately why he sent his son to die on a cross, so that the penalty for our rebellion could be paid, not by our own separation from God for all eternity, but by the unfitting punishment that Christ served. So with that, I hope that you enjoy this series that we'll have coming up the next few weeks, and I hope you'll get a lot of it. As for today, that's all I have for you. I hope you're able to get something out of it. Until we can meet again, God bless.